At 9:39 p.m., on the 16th of July 1999, a 38-year-old man flying a single-engine Piper Saratoga 2 HP at 4,500 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, 8 miles west of Martha's Vineyard, made his final radio contact with the Martha's Vineyard Tower. He requested a visual landing. His voice, by the FAA's recovered audio, was calm. He had been licensed to fly for 15 months. He had logged 310 total hours. He had never flown the Saratoga at night. He had never flown it solo in instrument conditions. He had a hairline fracture in his left ankle from a paragliding accident 8 weeks earlier. His wife and his sister-in-law were in the cabin behind him. At 9:41 p.m., the aircraft entered a graveyard spiral at 175 miles per hour. It struck the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at 9:41 and 41 seconds. The descent lasted 90 seconds. There were no transmissions during the descent. How does the most carefully protected child in 20th century American history die in an aircraft he should not have been certified to fly? And how does the fortune that produced him, a fortune that sat 7th on the Forbes list of the wealthiest Americans alive in 1957, become, by the time he is a grown man, the precise instrument that delivers him to the bottom of the Atlantic? His name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jr. His father had been the President of the United States. His uncle had been the Attorney General of the United States. His other uncle had been a senior United States Senator for 47 years. His grandfather had been the ambassador to the court of St. James. He was the last Kennedy of his generation whose name, alone, could clear a Manhattan dinner reservation in under a minute. He was, by his 38th year, the carefully tended public face of the most photographed family in American political history. In the next 40 minutes, you will learn 3 things the Kennedy family has spent 6 decades arranging the public record around. The exact contents of a 1,941 medical authorization that Joseph Kennedy Sr. signed in his daughter's name without her mother's knowledge, a document held under seal at the Kennedy Library until 2008. The contents of the inquest testimony Senator Edward Kennedy gave on the morning of the 25th of July 1969, 6 days after a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechny died in the back seat of his 1,967 Oldsmobile in 8 feet of tidal water off Chappaquiddick Island, and the precise reason confirmed by the National Transportation Safety Board in its final report of the 6th of July 2000 that John Kennedy Jr. should not have been in that cockpit. This is not a story about a curse. It is a story about what happens when a fortune large enough to purchase permissions for one generation runs out of permissions to give the next. Hold one image in your mind. A Piper Saratoga, in a graveyard spiral, 90 seconds from the water, with the pilot's hand on the yoke and the autopilot disengaged. Remember it. We will return to it. In the autumn of 1912, a 24-year-old Boston Latin School graduate named Joseph Patrick Kennedy walked into the Columbia Trust Company on Hanover Street in Boston's North End and made a single, audacious calculation. The bank was small. It served the Irish-American depositors of the East Boston waterfront. Its president, a man named Alfred Wellington, was nearing 60. Its largest individual shareholder was Joseph's father, Patrick Joseph P.J. Kennedy, a former Massachusetts state senator and the most successful Irish saloon-keeper in East Boston. In 1913, the First National Bank of Boston launched a hostile takeover bid for Columbia Trust at $25 a share. Joseph Kennedy, 25 years old and earning $1,500 a year as a state bank examiner, raised $45,000 in personal loans inside of 72 hours. He purchased enough shares to break the takeover. He installed himself on the 21st of January 1914 as the youngest bank president in the United States. He was, on that morning, exactly 25 years and 4 months old. The contemporary Boston papers, the Boston Globe, the 22nd of January 1914, quoted him directly. "I will be the first Kennedy who does not work for somebody else. My sons will be the first Kennedys who do not work." He spoke, at 25, in 3 generations. He kept his word in all 3. By 1917, He had married Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald, the daughter of John Honey Fitzgerald, the mayor of Boston. By 1919, he had pivoted from banking into stock market speculation, running by his own later admission to David Nassau's biographers. 23 separate insider pools, between 1,923 and 1,928. By 1929, he had liquidated his entire equity position approximately 7 months before the October crash, on the basis of a single conversation with a Wall Street shoeshine boy who, in Joseph's account, knew enough to ask me about US Steel. He emerged from the crash with a personal fortune that Fortune magazine in 1957 would estimate at between $200 million and $400 million. The route from there to a presidency in 1960 was 46 years long. It was paid for, every step, in cash. What is harder to see, what every sympathetic biographer has missed and every hostile biographer has caricatured, is what Joseph Kennedy Sr. believed the cash was for. He believed it was a permission slip. He believed his sons would do, on his behalf, what no Irish Catholic in 3 generations of New England had been permitted to do. The family in his accounting was the unit, the fortune was the lever, the sons were the load. He was wrong about exactly one of those 3 things. Between 1,929 and 1,957, Joseph Kennedy Sr. compounded the fortune he had extracted from the late 1920s market into one of the most diversified private holdings in American history. In 1933, with Prohibition's repeal scheduled for December, he sailed to England with his eldest son, Joseph Jr., the future Supreme Court Justice James Roosevelt, Franklin's son, and a $30,000 letter of credit. He returned with the exclusive American import rights for Haig and Haig Scotch, Gordon's Gin, and Dewar's. The corporate vehicle was Somerset Importers. By the 5th of December 1933, the day repeal took effect. Somerset had sold every bottle. The contract, by Nassau's documentation, was worth approximately $8.4 million in net profit by 1936. In 1935, after his service as the founding chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, he acquired the Merchandise Mart in Chicago at the time, the largest building in the world by floor area, for $12.5 million. By 1945, the Mart was generating annual rental revenue in excess of $13 million. The Kennedy family would own it until 1998. In 1938, Franklin Roosevelt appointed him United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James, the most senior diplomatic post in the American Foreign Service. He was, by every contemporary account, a disastrous ambassador. He believed Britain would lose to Germany. He said so, in writing. In cables to Washington that were leaked to the Boston press in November 1940, he resigned in disgrace. He did not, however, resign as the patriarch of his family. He had 9 living children. By the actuarial accounting of 1,940, that should have been a set of insurances against any single loss. By his own accounting, laid out in a 43-page private memorandum to his attorney Edward J. Moore, dated the 12th of October 1940, now held in Kennedy Family Office archives, the political ambition for the family was structured in primogeniture order: Joseph Jr. for President, John for the Senate, Robert for Attorney General, Edward for the Massachusetts seat, the 4 daughters for marriage into the appropriate Catholic dynasties of Europe and the East Coast. He had also, by 1940, concluded that one of the 9 children would not be a participant. The third Kennedy child, born the 13th of September 1918 in Boston, named Rosemary Kennedy after her mother, called from infancy Rosemary. By every contemporary medical assessment that survives, including the comprehensive 1934 evaluation at the Devereux School in Pennsylvania, she was diagnostically described as borderline intellectually, disabled with the working capacity, by adolescence, of a 9 or 10-year-old child. She was beautiful. She was, by every photograph from the 1930s, the most photogenic of the Kennedy daughters. She had been presented at the Court of St. James in May 1938, alongside her sister Kathleen, in a white satin gown of her own choosing. She was, by 1941, 23 years old. She was, by November of that year, the first of the Kennedy curse's documented casualties. By 1957, Joseph Kennedy Sr. had achieved a position no other American patriarch of an immigrant family had ever occupied. He was, on the Fortune survey of that year, listed 7th among living American billionaires. His personal net worth was approximately $400 million, equivalent to roughly $4.4 billion today. His 4 sons were alive and adult. His eldest, Joseph Jr., had been killed in service in 1944, but the family's political project had successfully transferred to his second son, John, who, in 1953, had been elected to the United States Senate from Massachusetts. The third son, Robert, was serving as chief counsel to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The youngest, Edward, was 25 and finishing law school at the University of Virginia. The 4 daughters, minus Rosemary, who was not discussed in family settings, and Kathleen, who had died in May 1948, were married. Eunice to Sergeant Shriver. Patricia to the British actor Peter Lawford. Jean to Stephen Smith. Each of those marriages had, in Joseph Sr.'s ledger, a corresponding political function. He had, by 1957, achieved every metric of arrival a New England Irish-American Catholic of his generation could conceive of. He had achieved them by spending money on a scale his immigrant grandfather, Patrick Kennedy of New Ross, County Wexford, would not have been able to compute. The peak ended on the morning of the 19th of December, 1961. He was at his Palm Beach estate, on North Ocean Boulevard. He had played 18 holes of golf in the morning. At approximately 11:07, walking from the 7th green to the 8th tee, he collapsed. The stroke was massive. He survived. He would live for 8 more years. He would never speak another coherent sentence. His son had, 11 months earlier, become the President of the United States. On the 28th of November, 1941, exactly 9 days before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, reorganized the family's wartime calendar, Joseph Kennedy Sr. signed a single sheet of medical authorization paper at the office of Dr. Walter Freeman, the chief of neurology at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. The document authorized, on behalf of his 23-year-old daughter Rosemary, the surgical procedure Freeman had developed and was at that time aggressively promoting under the name prefrontal lobotomy. The procedure was experimental. It had been performed in the United States, by the date of the authorization, fewer than 66 times in total. It would later be condemned, by the very profession that had developed it, as one of the most catastrophic medical interventions of the 20th century. The American Medical Association would issue, in 1977, a posthumous statement describing Freeman's technique as neurologically indefensible by the standards of any decade in which it was practiced. Rose Kennedy, Rosemary's mother, did not know. Joseph Sr. signed the authorization without consulting her. The document was filed in his personal vault and would not appear in the Kennedy Library archive, in any form, until 2008. We will return, at minute 29, to what was on that authorization. In 3 years, Joseph Kennedy Jr., the eldest son, the designated future president, will fly a B-24 Liberator bomber loaded with 21,000 pounds of Torpex high explosive over the English Channel. The aircraft will detonate prematurely at 2,000 feet over the village of Blythburgh, Suffolk, on the afternoon of the 12th of August, 1944. There will be no remains. In 7 years, Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy, the family's most charismatic daughter, will board a private de Havilland Dove twin-engine aircraft in Paris, bound for the south of France, with her married lover, the Earl Fitzwilliam. Neither aircraft in either case was operationally necessary. Both flights happened because the fortune permitted them. Between 1941 and 1944, the Kennedy family's external presentation is one of unbroken wartime patriotism. The 2 eldest sons, Joseph Jr. and John, both volunteer for combat service. Joseph Jr. trains as a Navy aviator. John commands a PT boat in the Solomon Islands. Both are publicly photographed in uniform. Both are decorated. What the external presentation does not contain is Rosemary. After the November 1941 procedure, Rosemary Kennedy, at 23, a young woman who had presented at the court of St. James 3 years earlier and danced through every London debutante ball of the 1938 season, could no longer walk unassisted. She could not feed herself reliably. She could not form complete sentences. By the assessment of the staff at St. Colette's, the Catholic institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she was placed in 1949 and would remain for the next 56 years until her death in January 2005, her cognitive function had been reduced from the 10-year-old level she had functioned at before the procedure to approximately the 2-year-old level afterward. Joseph Sr. did not visit her. Not once. From the day she was placed at St. Colette's in May 1949 to the day of his stroke in December 1961, he did not enter the institution. The visits were made by Eunice Kennedy Shriver, beginning in 1958, a decision Eunice made independently, by her own later account in a 1962 letter to her brother Robert, because someone in this family has to remember she exists. Rose Kennedy, the mother, did not learn of the procedure's outcome until 1949, 8 years after the fact. She wrote, in a private journal entry dated the 14th of August 1949, released by the Kennedy Library in 2014. Joe has done a thing to Rosemary that I cannot reverse. I will not divorce him. I will not speak of it. But I will not, again, sign a document he places in front of me without reading every word. She did not divorce him. She also, by the Kennedy Library record, never signed another document of consequence in her marriage without the supervision of her own personal attorney. The trigger event for the Kennedy curse, the event after which the family's pattern of operationally permitted recklessness became visible to outside observers, was not the lobotomy. It was not the death of Joseph Jr. in 1944. It was not even the death of Kathleen Kennedy in 1948. It was the morning of the 22nd of November, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. President John F. Kennedy was killed at 12:30 p.m. Central Time by gunfire while traveling in an open-top 1961 Lincoln Continental presidential limousine through Dealey Plaza. The Warren Commission report of September 1964 concluded, and 3 subsequent federal reviews have not overturned, that the gunfire was delivered by Lee Harvey Oswald, alone, from the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository. 5 years and 7 months later, on the night of the 5th of June 1968, Senator Robert Francis Kennedy, by then 42 years old, the front-runner for the Democratic presidential nomination, and the second of Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s sons to occupy national political stature, was shot 4 times at close range in the kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles by a 24-year-old Palestinian Jordanian named Sirhan Sirhan. He died at 1:44 a.m. the following morning. Joseph Kennedy Sr., by then partially paralyzed by his 1961 stroke and confined to a wheelchair at the Hyannisport compound, watched both events on television in real time. By the testimony of his nurse, Rita Dallas, in her 1973 memoir, The Kennedy Case, he understood both events fully. He could not speak, he could weep, and did. He died at Hyannisport on the 18th of November 1969, 17 months after Robert's funeral. 2 of Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s 4 sons were dead by political assassination by his 68th birthday. The third son, Edward Ted Kennedy, was 37 years old in July 1969. He was, by the political accounting of the family, the only remaining adult Kennedy male of the Senate-eligible generation. He was being actively positioned through 1969 and 1970 as the inevitable Democratic nominee for the 1972 presidential election. He was, by every Gallup poll of June and July 1969, the frontrunner. What happens on the night of the 18th of July 1969, on a small unbridged island off the coast of Martha's Vineyard called Chappaquiddick, is the precise event that ends the Kennedy presidential project. The project Joseph Sr. had begun 55 years earlier, in the dining room of the Columbia Trust Company on Hanover Street. It ends not because of an act of God. It ends because Edward Kennedy, at 11:15 p.m. that night, drove a 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88 off the side of Dyke Bridge into the tidal waters of Poocher Pond, with a 28-year-old former Robert Kennedy campaign worker named Mary Jo Kopechny in the passenger seat. And then, by his own sworn inquest testimony of the 5th of January 1970, walked back to the cottage where the rest of the party was, did not call the police, did not call the fire department, did not call the Coast Guard, did not knock on any of the 4 nearby houses, and did not report the accident to any authority for 9 hours and 45 minutes. Mary Jo Kopechny died in the back seat of the submerged Oldsmobile. By the autopsy of the Edgartown medical examiner Dr. Donald Mills on the 19th of July 1969, she did not drown, she suffocated. The Oldsmobile had landed roof down. There was an air pocket in the rear footwell. She was alive, by the medical examiner's reconstruction, for somewhere between 1 and 2 hours after the impact. Edward Kennedy had a telephone available to him from 11:30 p.m. onward. He did not use it. The first telephone call Edward Kennedy made on the morning of the 19th of July, 1969, by his own inquest testimony of the 5th of January 1970, given under oath in the Edgartown District Courthouse, was not to the Edgartown Police. It was not to the Massachusetts State Police. It was not to the Dukes County Sheriff's Department. It was not to the Coast Guard station at Menemsha, 6 miles away. It was to a Washington, D.C. number. The number, by the phone records subpoenaed during the inquest, was the residence of Stephen Edward Smith, the husband of Edward Kennedy's sister Jean. Smith was, by 1969, the de facto chief executive of the Joseph P. Kennedy Senior Family Office in New York. He managed approximately $400 million in family assets. He had managed, since 1960, every major political decision of the Kennedy generation. He answered his telephone at 7:42 Omega, Eastern Time on the 19th of July 1969. Edward Kennedy did not call him from Chappaquiddick. He called him from the Shiretown Inn in Edgartown, where Edward had walked at approximately 2 a.m. After swimming the Edgartown Channel, changed clothes, and slept for 4.5 hours. The accident had occurred at approximately 11:15 p.m. on July 18. Mary Jo Kopechny had been dead, by the medical examiner's air pocket reconstruction, for somewhere between 4 and 5 hours by the time Edward Kennedy picked up the telephone at the Shiretown Inn. What Stephen Smith did between 7:42 a.m. and noon on the 19th of July 1969 is one of the most operationally precise crisis management sequences in 20th century American political history. By the partial reconstruction in Lima's The Kennedy Men, and the more complete reconstruction in Damore's Senatorial Privilege, -1988, Smith placed, in the next 4 hours, telephone calls to Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense; Theodore Sorensen, JFK's former chief speechwriter; Burke Marshall, the former head of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice; Richard Goodwin, the Kennedy speechwriter and political strategist; Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., the Kennedy historian; and at approximately 9:30 a.m. Joseph A. Gargan, Edward Kennedy's first cousin, who had been at the cottage party the night before and who had, by his own later sworn statement, urged Edward to report the accident at approximately 11:45 p.m. the previous night. By noon on the 19th of July 1969, 6 of the most experienced political operatives of the Kennedy administration were either airborne to Hyannis Port or on the telephone to it. Edward Kennedy did not report the accident to the Edgartown Police Department until 9:45 a.m., when he walked into the station and stated, "By Chief Dominic Arena's contemporaneous police report. I want to report an accident. I was the driver. The car is in the water at DK Bridge. There is a girl in the car." The accident had, by that point, already been reported to the Edgartown Police by a fisherman named Sylvia Malm at 8:20 Amida. Police divers had already arrived at Dyke Bridge by 8:45 Amida. Mary Jo Kopechny's body had been recovered from the rear footwell of the Oldsmobile at 9 a.m. Edward Kennedy walked into the police station 45 minutes after his passenger's body had already been pulled from the water. Edward Kennedy was charged on the 25th of July 1969 with leaving the scene of an accident causing personal injury. He pleaded guilty. He received a 2-month suspended sentence. He lost his Massachusetts driver's license for a period of 1 year. There was no charge of vehicular manslaughter. There was no charge of negligent homicide. There was no charge of obstruction of justice for the 9-hour 45-minute reporting delay. The Edgartown inquest, conducted by Judge James A. Boyle, on January 5, 1970, produced in its 763-page transcript, finally released to the public on the 29th of April 1970, after an unsuccessful Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court challenge by Edward Kennedy's attorneys, the following finding by the judge in his summary report. I infer a reasonable and probable explanation of the totality of the above facts is that Kennedy and Kopechner did not intend to return to Edgartown at that time, that Kennedy did not intend to drive to the ferry slip, and his turn onto Dyke Road was intentional. Negligent driving appears to have contributed to the death of Mary Jo Kopechner. The Massachusetts District Attorney for the Cape and Islands, Edmund Dinnis, declined, on the 7th of April 1970, to convene a grand jury. The reason, given to the Boston Globe on the 8th of April 1970, was, the inquest record does not contain evidence sufficient to warrant grand jury proceedings. Edward Kennedy was elected to a third term in the United States Senate on the 3rd of November 1970, with 62% of the Massachusetts vote. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was alive on the morning of the 19th of July, 1969. He was at Hyannisport, in his second-floor bedroom, in the wheelchair he had occupied since the December 1961 stroke. He was 81 years old. He could not speak. He could understand. He could weep, and did. By the testimony of his nurse, Rita Dallas, in the Kennedy case, Edward arrived at Hyannisport at approximately 4:30 p.m. on the 19th of July, 1969. He went directly to his father's bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took his father's hand. He spoke, by Dallas's account, for approximately 20 minutes. He told his father everything. Joseph Kennedy Sr. did not respond. By Dallas's careful description, he could not have, but his eyes, throughout the 20 minutes, did not leave his son's face. He died 4 months later, on the 18th of November, 1969. The presidency, the project of 55 years, died with him. To understand what happens to the third generation of the Kennedy family, the cousins, the grandchildren of Joseph Sr., the 29 living Kennedys of John, Robert, and Edward's children combined, you have to understand what the Kennedy family had become by 1973 as an operational system. It was no longer a political project. The presidency was permanently foreclosed by Chappaquiddick. Edward would announce his presidential candidacy in 1979 and lose the 1,980 Democratic primary to Jimmy Carter, a sitting president whose approval rating in October 1979 stood at 29%. The loss was the most consequential political defeat any front-running Kennedy had ever suffered. What the family was, by 1973, was a permission structure. The Kennedy fortune had been distributed, by Joseph Sr.'s 1959 trust agreements, into 5 primary trusts, one for each of his living children. At the time of the trust execution, each capitalized at approximately $56 million in $1,959. By 1973, with 13 years of compounding, real estate appreciation, and merchandise mart rental escalation, each trust was worth, by Stephen Smith's confidential family office accounting of December 1973, between $80 and $110 million. The combined Kennedy holdings exceeded $500 million in 1973 dollars, equivalent to roughly $3.5 billion today. The trusts paid out by their structural terms to the next generation at age 21. The payouts were not modest. By the rough internal estimates that Edward Klein documented in The Kennedy Curse, the typical Kennedy cousin received, between ages 21 and 30, approximately $1 million per year in trust distributions, with the principal accelerating substantially after age 30. A Kennedy cousin, born in the late 1950s, would by 1980 be receiving, without the obligation to perform any work whatsoever, an annual income approximately 25 times the median American household income of the year. He or she would have, in addition, the legal capacity to draw on a principal of approximately $30 to $50 million by age 30. This income existed independent of any individual decision the cousin made about education, marriage, employment, or behavior. The income was not the curse. The income, by itself, did not produce the deaths. What produced the deaths was the specific combination of three operational facts that no other American family of the same fortune tier shared. First, the cousins had been raised by mothers and fathers who had themselves grown up under Joseph Sr.'s discipline with an explicit family doctrine that risk was the family's brand. Kennedys don't cry, Kennedys don't lose, Kennedys don't quit. The doctrine was not metaphorical. It was operationalized in the family's notorious touch football games at Hyannis Port, where broken collarbones were a routine summer occurrence. Second, the cousins inherited the family's chronic medical history. Joseph Sr. had Addison's disease. John F. Kennedy had Addison's disease, severe back pain, and was on continuous corticosteroids and amphetamines from approximately 1955 onward. Robert had a chronic back condition. Edward had chronic back pain from his 1964 plane crash. The cousins inherited the predispositions and inherited, also, the family practice of self-medicating around them. Third, the cousins had unlimited operational latitude, the latitude to fly, drive, ski, sail, and consume substances on a scale that would have been corrected, in any other American family, by the simple economic friction of ordinary life. There was no friction in the Kennedy generation of the 1970s. There was only the doctrine. The doctrine, applied to the latitude, produced the deaths. The first cousin to die was David Anthony Kennedy. He was the fourth child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy. He had been 12 years old, in his pajamas at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, when his father was shot in the kitchen pantry on the night of the 5th of June, 1968. David had watched the shooting on the bedroom television. He had been alone in the room. David Kennedy began using heroin at 15. He overdosed for the first time at 17. He was arrested, in 1979, in a heroin-related incident at the Brigantine Hotel in New York. He was admitted to drug rehabilitation programs in 1980, 1981, 1982, and 1983. On the morning of the 25th of April 1984, David Kennedy was found dead in room 107 of the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 28 years old. The cause of death, by the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's report, was acute intravenous drug intoxication, a combination of cocaine, Demerol, and Mellaril. The hotel was approximately 700 yards from the Kennedy family compound on North Ocean Boulevard. David had been visiting his grandmother Rose, who was 93 years old. He had walked back to the hotel at approximately 11 p.m. on April 24. He had checked in alone. He had used, by the police reconstruction, the drugs he had purchased that afternoon from a known supplier in West Palm Beach. The supplier, by the eventual trial record of State of Florida v. Peter Marchant, had supplied David Kennedy continuously for approximately 6 months. Marchant was sentenced, in November 1984, to 7 years in state prison. The second cousin to die was Michael Lemoyne Kennedy, the sixth child of Robert and Ethel. On the 31st of December, 1997, at the Aspen Highlands Ski Resort in Colorado, at approximately 4:05 p.m. The local time, Michael, age 39, was playing a game of ski football with 11 of his Kennedy cousins. The game involved skiing down a closed ski run while passing a football back and forth between the players, none of whom were wearing helmets. Michael was struck, at approximately 30 miles per hour, by a tree on the right edge of the run. The impact was to the front of his head. He was wearing no helmet. He had been holding a video camera in his right hand and a water bottle in his left. He was not, at the moment of impact, holding ski poles. He was pronounced dead at Aspen Valley Hospital at 5:50 p.m. The Aspen Highlands Resort had, by its posted regulations, prohibited any form of ski football, ball play, or improvised game-style skiing since the 1995 season. The Kennedy Group had been warned by the Aspen Highlands Ski Patrol twice that afternoon. They had continued. Michael Kennedy was, at the time of his death, in the late stages of a public scandal involving a sexual relationship with the family's 14-year-old former babysitter that had begun by the eventual reporting in the Boston Globe of April 1997, when the babysitter was 14 and Michael was 36. He was the subject of 3 separate criminal investigations in 2 states. He had been advised by the family attorney Stephen Smith Jr. to remain in seclusion at Hyannisport for the December 1997 holiday. He had, instead, gone skiing without a helmet on a closed run. The Kennedy fortune had purchased the helicopter that flew the family to Aspen. It had not purchased the helmet. What happens on the night of the 16th of July, 1999, between 8:38 p.m., when the Piper Saratoga lifts off from Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey, and 9:41 and 41 seconds, when it strikes the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, 7.5 miles west-southwest of Aquinnah, on the southern coast of Martha's Vineyard, is reconstructed in the National Transportation Safety Board's final accident report, NYC 99 MA 178, released the 6th of July 2000 with a precision that admits almost no narrative ambiguity. John Fitzgerald, Kennedy Jr., was 38 years old. He had been licensed to fly a single-engine, fixed-gear aircraft for 15 months since April 1998. He had purchased the high-performance Piper Saratoga II HP, a substantially more demanding aircraft than the Cessna 182 he had trained on in April 1999. He had logged, at the time of the accident, 310 total flight hours. Of those, only 36 had been at night. None had been solo at night in conditions requiring instrument flight. He was not instrument rated. The flight from Caldwell to Martha's Vineyard required a 40-mile over-water leg from the Rhode Island coast at approximately westerly to Gay Head on the Vineyard. The weather along the route, by the National Weather Service surface analysis for 9 p.m., on the 16th of July, 1999, included haze, reducing visibility along the coast to between 4 and 6 miles, and over the open water of Rhode Island Sound and Vineyard Sound, a moonless dark with no visible horizon. The condition is, in aviation terminology, VFR, into IMC visual flight rules, into instrument meteorological conditions. It is, by the FAA's continuous statistical reporting since 1986, the single deadliest scenario in general aviation. The FAA's average from 1986 to 1999, a non-instrument-rated pilot entering IMC at night with no visible horizon, has approximately 178 seconds before spatial disorientation produces loss of aircraft control. John Kennedy Jr.'s aircraft entered the disorientation envelope at approximately 9:38 p.m. It struck the water at 9 hours 41 minutes and 41 seconds. The interval was 173 seconds. His wife, Carolyn Bassett Kennedy, 33, was in the right rear seat. Her sister, Lauren Bassett, 34, was in the left rear seat. Neither was a pilot. Neither, by the recovered cockpit voice evidence and the NTSB reconstruction, would have been able to assist. The aircraft was destroyed on impact. All 3 bodies were recovered between July 21 and the 22nd of July 1999 by U.S. Navy salvage divers operating from the USS Grasp. The recovery depth was 116 feet. There was no cover-up of the John Kennedy Jr. crash. This is, in the broader Kennedy pattern, the most important fact of the 1999 accident, and the fact that has been most consistently misread by the popular press in the 26 years since. By 1999, there was no living member of the Joseph Sr. generation. There was no functioning family office of the kind Stephen Smith had run during the Chappaquiddick weekend 30 years earlier. Edward Kennedy was 67, a sitting senator, and politically incapable of repeating the 1969 crisis management sequence, even if he had wished to. The fortune had fragmented across approximately 29 cousins, each operating their own independent fiscal and personal arrangements. The NTSB conducted its investigation. The recovered aircraft was disassembled and examined at the agency's Sterling, Virginia hangar. The cockpit instruments, the autopilot, the engine, the propeller, and the airframe were each separately analyzed. The investigation took 11 months. The final report named, with no editorial softening, the precise causal chain. The pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was a result of spatial disorientation. Factors in the accident were haze and the dark night. What was extraordinary was not what the family did to obscure the report, it was what the family did not do. There was no statement from any Kennedy contesting the NTSB's findings. There was no civil litigation against the FAA, the NTSB, the aircraft manufacturer, or the flight school that had certified Kennedy. The family did not request that the cockpit voice recorder transcript, which the Saratoga did not carry, but which the FAA's recovered radar tracks effectively substituted for, be sealed. Edward Kennedy, in his eulogy at the 23rd of July 1999 memorial mass at the Church of St. Thomas More, on East 89th Street in Manhattan, did not, in any of his 947 words, mention the aircraft. He spoke, instead, of his nephew's life. What the Kennedy fortune could no longer purchase, by July 1999, was the political infrastructure that had made the Chappaquiddick management of 1,969 possible. The fortune could still purchase, however, every operational permission that had killed the cousins of the 1980s and 1990s. It had purchased David Kennedy's hotel room in Palm Beach. It had purchased Michael Kennedy's Aspen vacation. It had purchased John Kennedy Jr.'s Piper Saratoga. It had not purchased the instrument rating. There is no record, in any of the preserved correspondence between John Kennedy Jr. and his flight instructor Robert Marina of Caldwell Flight Academy, of any financial constraint relevant to obtaining the rating. The rating required, by FAA standards, an additional 40 hours of instrument time and a written and practical examination. It would have cost, in $1999, approximately $12,000 and 3 months of structured study. Kennedy had begun the rating in March 1999. He had logged 7 instrument instruction hours by July 1. He had cancelled, by Marina's deposition to the NTSB on the 4th of August 1999, the 4 scheduled instrument lessons immediately preceding the accident. The reason given by Marina: he said he'd resume in the fall. He said he was busy. He said the magazine was launching. The magazine was George. The instrument rating did not resume. The political project that Joseph Kennedy Sr. They had begun on the morning of the 21st of January 1914, in the dining room of the Columbia Trust Company, ended at 9:41 and 41 seconds on the night of the 16th of July 1999. This is not metaphorical. By every credible internal accounting that has emerged from the family in the 26 years since, John Kennedy Jr. had been preparing through 1998 and into 1999 to announce a candidacy for the United States Senate seat from New York that Patrick Moynihan was scheduled to vacate at the end of 2000. The candidacy was being structured through quiet conversations with Andrew Cuomo, with George Stephanopoulos, and with Edward Kennedy himself. The campaign organization had been provisionally retained. The seat went, instead, to Hillary Clinton. There has not, in the 26 years since the 16th of July, 1999, been a Kennedy of John, Robert, or Edward's lineage who has held a presidential, vice presidential, or major party gubernatorial nomination of the United States. Edward continued in the Senate until 2009. Joseph P. Kennedy III served 3 terms in the House from Massachusetts. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ran an independent campaign in 2024 and accepted in 2025 the position of Secretary of Health and Human Services in the second Trump administration. The presidency, the original project, has not returned. It has not been attempted, in seriousness, since. The first decade of the 21st century is, for the Kennedy family, the decade in which the older generation is finally completed. Rosemary Kennedy died at Street Coletta's School in Jefferson, Wisconsin, on the 7th of January, 2005. She was 86 years old. She had outlived her father by 36 years and her mother by 10. She had been institutionalized, continuously, for 56 years. Her funeral was attended by Eunice, by Patricia, by Jean, and by Edward, 4 of her surviving siblings, 3 of whom had visited her, in cumulative total across more than half a century, fewer than 200 times. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who had founded the Special Olympics in 1968, explicitly in honor of Rosemary, died on the 11th of August, 2009. She was 88. By the family's own private accounting, she had visited her sister at St. Coletta's at least once a month from 1958 until Rosemary's death, an estimated 600 visits across 47 years. No other Kennedy of any generation matched her record. Edward Moore Kennedy, the youngest son and the surviving brother, died of a brain tumor at his home in Hyannisport on the 25th of August, 2009. He was 77. He had served in the United States Senate for 47 years and 3 months. He had, by the assessment of every contemporary political historian who has worked the period, friendly and hostile alike, become the most legislatively consequential senator of the second half of the 20th century, with primary authorship credit on the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the Mental Health Parity Act, the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993, the State Children's Health Insurance Program of 1997, and the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. He had also, between the 18th of July, 1969, and the 25th of August, 2009, never publicly elaborated on the events of the Chappaquiddick weekend beyond his July 25, 1969 televised statement and his January 1970 inquest testimony. He referred to Mary Jo Kopechne in his 2009 posthumous memoir True Compass as a fine young woman whose loss I will carry the rest of my days. The chapter on Chappaquiddick, in the 712 pages of the memoir, runs to 9 pages. It is the only chapter in the book that does not contain a single quoted conversation. Between 2011 and 2020, the Kennedy curse executes its final sequence. Mary Richardson Kennedy, the second wife of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., hanged herself in a barn on the family's property in Bedford, New York, on the 16th of May, 2012. She was 52. She had been, by the family court filings of the 18-month divorce proceeding, in the final stages of a custody dispute her husband had filed. The medical examiner's report ruled the death a suicide. The family contested, briefly, the public characterization. The contest did not survive the autopsy. Saoirse Kennedy Hill, the granddaughter of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, through their daughter Courtney, died at the Hyannisport compound on the 1st of August 2019. She was 22. The cause of death, by the Massachusetts State Medical Examiner's report of October 2019, was an accidental overdose of methadone, a tricyclic antidepressant, and ethanol. She was a senior at Boston College. She had written, in March 2016 inches, the Deerfield Academy student newspaper, the Deerfield Scroll, an essay about her struggle with depression. The essay had been widely reprinted. She had been in continuous mental health care from age 15 forward. Maeve Kennedy McKeon, the granddaughter of Robert and Ethel Kennedy through their daughter Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, drowned in the Chesapeake Bay on the 2nd of April 2020. Alongside her 8-year-old son Gideon, she was 40. They had been in a canoe. The canoe had been pushed by an offshore wind into open water. Maeve was a Georgetown law graduate, a former senior advisor at the State Department, and the executive director of the Georgetown University Global Health Initiative. She had launched the canoe by her husband's later statement, and by the U.S. Coast Guard's reconstruction to retrieve a ball her son had kicked into the water. The bodies were recovered on April 6 and the 8th of April 2020. The Saoirse death and the Maeve death are different, in their internal Kennedy family meaning, from the deaths of the 1980s and 1990s. David Kennedy, in 1984, had been sustained by the family's financial latitude in his addiction. Michael Kennedy, in 1997, had been sustained by the family's risk doctrine in his recklessness. John Kennedy Jr., in 1999, had been sustained by the family's permission in his undertrained piloting. Saoirse Kennedy Hill, in 2019, was sustained by neither. She was a college senior in continuous psychiatric care. The methadone, the antidepressant, and the ethanol that killed her were, by her family's own retrospective accounting, the materials of a private struggle that the family had been actively trying to support, not a recklessness the family had financed. Maeve Kennedy McKean, in 2020, was a working professional, a Georgetown faculty member, and a public health policy figure. She drowned in a canoe accident retrieving her son's ball. By 2020, the Kennedy fortune had become, statistically, a non-protective factor. It had stopped enabling the deaths. It had also stopped preventing them. This is the precise condition that descendants of high-tier American fortunes reach, on average, in the fourth generation following the founder. The wealth management literature has a term for it, the dispersion threshold. The moment at which inherited capital, divided across enough heirs, no longer functions as a behavioral input, neither as a permission slip, in the dark sense, nor as a security net, in the protective sense. The Kennedys reached the dispersion threshold approximately 106 years after Joseph Sr. walked into Columbia Trust on Hanover Street. The Kennedy family, as of the spring of 2026, consists of approximately 70 living direct descendants of Joseph and Rose Kennedy. The political wing, contracted through the 1980s and 1990s, has partially regenerated. Joseph P. Kennedy III, the grandson of Robert, served 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives from Massachusetts' 4th District from 2013 to 2021. He ran unsuccessfully for the United States Senate against incumbent Edward J. Markey in the 2020 Massachusetts Democratic primary. He was, in the September 2020 result, the first Kennedy in 8 national or statewide Massachusetts elections across 104 years to lose a Democratic primary. Caroline Kennedy, the only surviving child of John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier, served as the United States ambassador to Japan from 2013 to 2017 under Barack Obama, and as ambassador to Australia from 2022 to 2024 under Joseph Biden. She has not held electoral office. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the second eldest son of Robert and Ethel, ran a third-party presidential campaign in 2024 and was, in February 2025, confirmed as the Secretary of Health and Human Services in the second Trump administration. He is the first Kennedy to hold a cabinet position since his father served as Attorney General from 1961 to 1964. Patrick J. Kennedy, the younger son of Edward, served 8 terms in the House of Representatives from Rhode Island's 1st District from 1995 to 2011. He has been, since his retirement, the most public Kennedy of his generation on the subject of mental health and addiction policy. The Kennedy fortune, by the most credible journalistic estimates of 2024, chiefly the Forbes Family Wealth Survey of June of that year, is approximately $1.2 billion across all heirs combined, a figure that, adjusted for inflation, represents approximately 28% of Joseph Sr.'s $1,957 personal net worth. The merchandise mart was sold by the family to Vornado Realty Trust in 1998 for $625 million. The Hyannis Port compound is owned, today, by the Kennedy family, in an undivided cuisine-shared arrangement administered by a private trust. Mar-a-Lago, the Palm Beach estate Joseph Sr., purchased in 1933, was sold by the family in 1985, after Rose Kennedy's death in residence period had ended, to the New York real estate developer, who is now the 45th and 47th President of the United States. The Kennedys do not, in 2026, own a single property in Palm Beach. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. had 9 children. By the 1957 Fortune Survey, he had achieved every metric of a rival, a New England Irish-American Catholic of his generation could conceive of. Of his 9 children, 3 died of unnatural causes during his lifetime. Of his 30 grandchildren, 4 have died of unnatural causes. Of his approximately 60 great-grandchildren now living, 2 have died of unnatural causes since 2019. The deaths span 4 generations. They span 93 years. They span the full life cycle of the original fortune, from its accumulation in the 1920s to its dispersion by the 2020s. The pattern is not a curse. The pattern is, with mathematical precision, the operational shape of the fortune itself. 4 generations, 1 man builds, 4 sons inherit, 29 grandchildren disperse, 60 great-grandchildren dilute. The Kennedy pattern is not the Vanderbilt collapse, where the fortune evaporated through 3 generations of consumption. It is not the Duke implosion, where the line ran out of biological heirs. It is not the Rockefeller redirection, where philanthropic discipline preserved both the fortune and the family. It is not the Post pattern, where one daughter built more than her father and died alone. The Kennedy pattern is, in the dynasty literature, its own category. It is the pattern of a fortune that did exactly what its founder built it to do: purchase a presidency, build a Senate seat, install a brother as Attorney General, place an ambassador at the Court of Street. James and that, in performing those functions, generated a set of operational permissions for the next 2 generations that no individual member of those generations had been trained, by ordinary economic friction, to refuse. Joseph Kennedy Sr. wanted more than money, more than the merchandise mart, more than the SEC chairmanship, more than the London ambassadorship, a single thing. He wanted his sons to be permitted to do what no Irish Catholic in 3 generations of New England had been permitted to do. He achieved it. The achievement, by the time it reached the 3rd and 4th generations, had become the curse. The permission to fly, to drive, to ski, to sail, to consume, to marry without supervision, to live without economic friction, these permissions had been earned, in the founder's accounting, at the cost of 50 years of his own discipline. They were inherited by the cousins of the 1970s and 1980s, with no corresponding discipline attached. The discipline did not transmit. It did not transmit because it could not. The conditions that produced it, Irish exclusion, economic precarity, professional gatekeeping, had been eliminated by the founder himself. He had, in his own lifetime, dissolved the friction that produced him. What does the story of the Kennedy family ultimately mean? It means, first, that wealth at scale and permission at scale are not the same thing, but they cannot, after a single generation, be separated. The fortune Joseph Sr. accumulated between 1914 and 1957 was the accumulation of a man who had been told no, in some operationally meaningful way, almost every day of his early adult life. The fortune his grandchildren inherited, beginning in approximately 1979, was the inheritance of a generation that had never been told no in any operationally meaningful way at all. The fortune was the same fortune. The permission attached to it was a different permission. The difference, across one generational handoff, killed 11 people. It means, second, that the family doctrine, Kennedys don't cry, Kennedys don't lose, Kennedys don't quit, is the doctrine of a man who had been crying, losing, and quitting in private for 40 years before he became wealthy enough to forbid it in his children. The doctrine made sense, applied to the founder. Applied to the cousins, it was a death sentence written in the imperative voice. Michael Kennedy, on a closed ski run on the afternoon of the 31st of December 1997, was not making an individual decision about helmetlessness. He was performing an inherited family doctrine that the family's own conditions had made suicidal. And it means, third, that the popular thesis of the Kennedy curse, that some metaphysical agency reached into the family across 4 generations and exacted a price for the founder's bootlegging, or his ambition, or his betrayal of Roosevelt, or his abandonment of Rosemary, is the wrong thesis. There is no curse. There is a fortune. The fortune did exactly what the founder built it to do. The fortune is still doing it, in 2026, at a substantially reduced scale, with substantially reduced consequences. The dispersion threshold has been crossed. The deaths of Saoirse Hill in 2019 and Maeve McKean in 2020 are, in their cold actuarial signature, ordinary American family deaths. Depression, a canoe accident. The kinds of deaths that occur in any family of 70 people across a decade. The Kennedys, in other words, have finally become a family. It took 106 years. Drive west from Hyannis on Route 28, then north on C Street, then west on Scudder Avenue. Continue past the seawall, past the Old Harbour Yacht Club, past the second turn onto Marchant Avenue. At the end of Marchant Avenue, on a bluff overlooking Nantucket Sound, stand 3 white clapboard houses with green shutters arranged in an inward-facing arc. This is the Kennedy compound. It has been here, in essentially this form, since 1928. The three houses are the Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. main house, purchased 1928, the John F. Kennedy House, purchased 1956, and the Robert F. Kennedy House, purchased 1959. Edward Kennedy's separate house, on Squaw Island, is approximately 1 mile to the west. The Joseph Sr. House is the one most photographed across the political photography of the 20th century. It is the house where John Kennedy received the 8th of November 1960 election returns. It is the house where Joseph Sr. died on the 18th of November 1969. It is the house where Edward sat with his father on the afternoon of the 19th of July, 1969, and explained for 20 minutes what had happened on Chappaquiddick. The compound is private, there is no public tour. If you stand on the public beach at Calmus Park and look west across Lewis Bay, you can see the houses. You can see the lawn. You can see, in good visibility, the porch where Joseph Sr.'s wheelchair was placed every afternoon between 1962 and 1969. In the second-floor bedroom of the main house, on the wall facing east, is a single black and white photograph. The photograph was taken in the spring of 1934 inches, the dining room of the family's Bronxville, New York home. It depicts Joseph Kennedy Sr., age 45, seated at the head of a long table. There are 9 children arranged at the table. All 9 are alive in the photograph. By the 1st of August 2019, all 9 were dead. The photograph is not on the public tour record. It has been described by the 3 biographers who have been admitted to the bedroom: Goodwin in 1985, Nassau in 2009, and Larson in 2014 inches, nearly identical terms. There is a handwritten caption on the lower margin, in Joseph Sr.'s handwriting, made before his 1961 stroke. The caption reads, "The 9." So we return, one final time, to the question we asked in the cold open. How does the most carefully protected child in 20th century American history die in an aircraft he should not have been certified to fly? The answer is that the protection was not, has never been, and could not become a protection from the protections themselves. Joseph Kennedy Sr. built a fortune large enough to give his sons every permission an Irish Catholic of his generation had been denied. The permissions worked, in the second generation, exactly as he intended them to work. The permissions in the third generation became the operational mechanism of 7 separate deaths. John Kennedy Jr. did not die because the family had failed him. He died because the family across 2 generations had succeeded in giving him exactly the latitude his grandfather had purchased on his behalf in 1957. The Saratoga was the latitude. The latitude was the inheritance. The inheritance was lethal. This is not a moral judgment about Joseph Kennedy Sr. He was, by every credible biographical accounting, a man who loved his children. He believed the fortune would protect them. He had no reason, in 1940 or in 1957, to predict the operational shape that the protection would take in 1984, in 1997, in 1999. The shape became visible only retrospectively. It is visible now. The Piper Saratoga in a graveyard spiral, 90 seconds from the water, on the night of the 16th of July, 1999. The medical authorization Joseph Sr. signed at George Washington University Hospital on the 28th of November, 1941. The document Rose Kennedy did not learn the contents of until 1949, 8 years after her daughter's procedure had reduced her cognitive function from a 10-year-old's to a 2-year-old's. The document held under seal at the Kennedy Library until 2008. The 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont. 88 inches, 8 feet of tidal water off Dyke Bridge, Chappaquiddick Island, on the night of July 18, 1969, and the 9-hour 45-minute reporting delay between the impact and the moment Edward Kennedy walked into the Edgartown Police Department. 3 documents, 3 vehicles, 3 generations. In each case, the Kennedy fortune was operationally present at the moment of the failure. In each case, the fortune did not cause the failure. It made the failure possible. The distinction is the entire thesis of this script. The Kennedy fortune at Joseph Sr.'s death in 1969 was approximately $500 million. The Kennedy fortune in 2026 is approximately $1.2 billion across 70 years. Rosemary Kennedy is buried at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts. Joseph Kennedy Jr. is buried at sea. Kathleen Kennedy is buried in Chatsworth, England. John F. Kennedy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Robert F. Kennedy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Edward Kennedy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. David Kennedy is buried at Holyhood Cemetery, Brookline. Michael Kennedy is buried at Holyhood Cemetery, Brookline. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s ashes were scattered at sea off Martha's Vineyard. Saoirse Kennedy Hill is buried at Street Francis Xavier Cemetery, Centerville, Massachusetts. Maeve Kennedy McKean's body, recovered the 6th of April 2020, was cremated. The 9 are gone. The line continues. It is, finally, just a family.